So hi everybody, my name is Micha Sifri. I am a member of NYCD 16 Indivisible. Yeah. In my day job, I run a place called Civic Hall downtown in Manhattan, which is a community center focused on using tech for the public good. And we do lots of public events there too, by the way. And I volunteered to just organize this event since we knew there was a lot of interest and confusion and questions that people have about this question that's going to be on the ballot next month on whether or not we should have a constitutional convention. So in a second, I'll get everything rolling. I just wanted to first ask, how many people here are members of NYCD 16 Indivisible? Okay, most of you. And if you're not, hopefully you've signed up and gave us your email so we can put you on our email list. I was going to say, in the interest of just getting to know each other, if there's, we should take 1 minute and literally do the, turn to somebody you don't know and just introduce yourself and say where you're from. Okay? And if you know everybody, that's fantastic.
Where are you from? Oh, Terrytown. Have you been to any you're from the Bronx? Oh, where? That's good. So do you have any inclination of how you go on the seashore?
What street? Oh, the right around the
Yeah.
Yes, we live on our
Yeah, so that seems to be talk to more people who are on the other side of this. But my first thought is the whole picture. Yeah, I think that's right.
Because my instinct when people ask me is to say, but I wonder, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, right. So the first thing to do is my third Wednesday is sit through, and the first one was in the Bronx at the Bronx.
Okay. So,
Yes.
now that we broke the ice a little,
So I asked the question about big money process.
so that's great. So I just want to say that to me, the most important thing about Indivisible and any local group that you're involved in that involves you with your neighbors in facing big political issues around us is incredibly vital. It could be the most important thing that we do as progressives is figure out how to create more ongoing local community organizations that get involved or support other people when specific groups are facing attack, even if it isn't us. The people if you feel like the world is going to pieces, you're not alone. And finding the others and being together with each other in an ongoing way is the most critical thing that we can do. A lot of us have grown up in a culture where that doesn't exist because of television and because of the internet and all sorts of other things that have made it really easy just to stay in your little bubble or even just in your own home and not socializing. And 100 years ago, that was not what America was like, right? We were way more involved. We were way more connected in local organizations. There were lots of problems with them. They excluded people on the basis of gender or race or ethnic identity. I'm not saying it was a golden age. But the one thing that was good is that people knew each other locally and were connected around their common concerns. So this is the most important work. Deciding how you vote on something is to me, secondary. So anyway, just to start on this question of the Constitution Convention, here's how we're going to do things. We have two great speakers, one from either side of the question, both with great progressive values and credentials. Art Chang, who is speaking on the pro side, is a longtime leader in New York City's political reform fights and is himself now active with a new project that he calls the Sanctuary State Project. I'll let him explain that. And then next to him, Ava Ben Ezra is an organizer with the New York State Working Families Party, which I think a lot of us already know quite well as a stalwart force for all kinds of progressive fights and struggles in New York State. And she's going to be speaking on the anti-side. The format, which we discussed beforehand with the steering committee, and is, first of all, that we'd like this to be a civil conversation. It's okay to disagree within the family, all right? And still be a family. We don't have to convince each other. This is about helping everyone inform themselves, and the group itself is not taking a position on this question, okay? We wanted to have a forum where people could listen and learn and make up their own minds. So you'll have a chance to ask questions or make comments, but just remember that it's okay if somebody who you love in the room has the opposite position from you, that hopefully you can still go out of this meeting friends, because that's more important, and we're probably not all going to agree. The second thing is simply with the format. We're going to start with a brief introduction about the process from me, and then we actually didn't do a coin flip or anything. Why don't you flip a coin and decide which one of you will go first? And then we'll have each of them speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll sit and maybe have a little bit of quick follow-up between them, based on, I'll ask them one or two questions based on what they've said, and then the rest of the meeting we will open it up to you to ask questions or make statements, but we're going to try and keep them short. I like to joke, if you tell people in a room that, it's time for questions, I always say, just if you're going to make a statement, phrase it in the form of a question. We know some people may want to just make statements, that's okay. All right, but not long ones, because we're not here just to harangue. We just also thought it would be fun to poll the room before we do all of this, and then after, and that will also allow us to see maybe if, where the room is on this question, and maybe if minds get changed.
Make sure to include an undecided in the
Right.
Of course. I should say, as somebody who I am myself undecided, I was going to do that, don't worry. So the question is, which will be on the ballot, is should New York State hold a constitutional convention? If your feeling right now is yes, raise your hand. Okay, we have 2 yeses. And if your feeling right now is no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 11, 12, 16. You changed your mind in the middle. Oh, 17. Oh, you thought I got you. Okay, 17 no, 2 yes. And if you're undecided, okay, a lot of undecideds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, so 17 undecided, 17 no, 2 yes. All right, somebody write that down, because I'm not going to remember. Okay, so here's the process. If we could go to the next slide. So this is something that's embedded in our state's constitution. And in fact, it's not just New York that has this feature. There are, I think, about 14 states that, as part of their own constitution, require that there be a regular opportunity for the voters to decide to change their constitution. And historically, this happened much more frequently in the early days of the Republic than more recently. The last time New York State, let's go to the next one, please. Okay, and there's a very specific wording required. So this is what you're going to see on the ballot. When you go to vote, it's going to be on the back of the ballot. There are actually 3 different questions being put to the public. This is the first one. Shall there be a convention to revise the Constitution and amend the same? Yes or no? Next slide. Now, the process is as follows, because it doesn't right away get amended. Obviously, it's about having a convention, and then what happens? So the next step, if this passes, is that there will be an election next year, 2018, at the same time that we're having the regular fall election, for delegates to a convention. And the delegates get selected by state senate districts. And there are 3 delegates per district. And in addition, there will be a total of 15 elected statewide, for a grand total of 204. So people would circulate petitions to get on the ballot the same way they do now to get on the ballot in a state senate race. The parties can have primaries, and then we'll have an election in November where you're choosing up to 3 delegates per state senate district. Okay? Next. Then we have a constitutional convention. The delegates meet and organize themselves. They decide what process they're going to use. And while they're doing this, they're getting paid about close to $80,000 on an annual basis for the time they're putting in being delegates. And one issue that has arisen, and since the question may come up, if somebody's already getting paid from the state because there's, a state elected official, can they get this too? And the answer is yes. Okay, they have a convention in 2019. That convention then, assuming it agrees on anything, puts together a package of changes, and it decides whether the proposed changes to the Constitution get voted on separately or as one unified package. So the last time we had a convention was in 1967, and that was actually a convention that took place because the legislature asked the people if they wanted to have a convention. It was not one of the ones required by the Constitution. It was outside of that. But this is the last time where there was a yes, let's have a convention. That convention met in 1967 and ultimately failed because the package of reforms that they were proposing were unified, and the voters voted down the entire package. There was no opportunity to vote for separate items. Okay? Last slide. So, to sum up, to change the Constitution by this process, there are actually 3 votes. The first one is the one we're facing now, to call a convention. The second one, next year, will be to pick delegates. And then the third one, after the delegates finish their work, will be to ratify or reject. Okay? And just to be clear, there is one other way to change the Constitution in New York State, which is the legislative path, right? And it has been changed a couple of times that way. And the way that works is the state legislature, both houses, have to first come up with a proposed amendment, pass it, and then 2 years later, when there's a new legislature, they have to pass the exact same amendment. It has to get through 2 cycles, and then it goes to the public for a vote. Okay? So that's the other pathway available. All right. I think that's it on my slides. Who's the lucky winner of the first?
I believe it is me.
All right, Ava, come on.
Thank you so much for having me again. My name is Ava, and I'm an organizer with the New York Working Families Party. We're a progressive third party in New York State and in 14 other states, and rapidly expanding chapters and clubs. Is that better?
Yes, and slow down a little.
If you could raise your hand maybe every 30 seconds, because I'm sure I'm going to speed back up, that would be great. I'm also a little bit sick, so if I sneeze onto the mic, I'm sorry about that too. But yeah, so our member organizations at the New York Working Families Party are kind of the main core of groups, I think, that have been really pushing the con side here. They are labor unions and community groups who are really concerned about the outcome that this might have for their members and what it will mean for all of our political priorities to be thinking about this to the exclusion of so many other really pressing fights in the coming years, the coming 3 years, as was just pointed out. So I think Art and I probably agree on, basically everything we would ever want to get out of this Constitution. I think we share like the same critique of what's wrong with our democracy right now, and all of the ways in which it is broken. And if the Constitutional Convention passes, like I very strongly imagine that we'll be working on the same side to see a lot of these progressive issues get passed and see the reforms that we want to see happen come to bear. The problem is I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that there's such a small likelihood of us being able to get what we want out of this process, and that we are risking truly so much along the way. In all likelihood, I think one of two things will happen. It'll be either a terrible disaster for working families, or just a terrible waste of resources for all of the organizations that lead progressive social fights in this state. So what do I mean by that? As was just shared, literally anything can go on the Constitution, or any proposal can be proposed by the delegates. The delegates come up with the rules. New York State Constitution, it's not perfect by any means, but it's pretty good. It has like a lot of really strong things in it that kind of form the backbone of our labor movement in New York State, which in turn forms the backbone of all of our other progressive fights. All of New York State's environmental protections are in the Constitution. The right to form a union is guaranteed by national law, but not by our Constitution nationally. So if we got rid of it here, we're at the whim of national moods about the labor movement, which doesn't make me feel particularly safe. We've got prevailing wage law in the Constitution in New York State. Something really important is that we also have the right to a quality-free public education. Probably some of you remember the big fight that is still ongoing about how New York State schools are underfunded. There's like that fight, the cornerstone of that was a lawsuit that was brought against the state of New York, which we could only do because it's in our Constitution that every young person in New York has the right to a free, quality public education. So any of those things are up for debate. Or things could be added to the Constitution that we haven't even anticipated yet. In Michigan and Wisconsin, people said it could never happen there also, but right to work did happen. And I'd be willing to bet someone would try really hard to make sure that it would happen here as well. And in fact, I don't have to bet. Robert Mercer has said as much. So in all likelihood, as was laid out, that's kind of the second step, right? That happens in the convention part. Then, of course, it goes to ballot. And it's true that I don't think in New York State that we're going to face a reality in which the majority of New Yorkers vote for a right to work legislation or take out environmental protections. But I do think that it's going to take all of our trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's 3 years out from now. As was mentioned, there's no rules laid out for the delegates beforehand. They can do whatever they want. They can make a rule that says, we can debate all of this in secret, and you won't know what ends up on the ballot until the day we're ready to come public with it. They can make a rule that said the number of propositions that end up on the ballot have to be in proportion to the parties, the party distribution of the delegates that are elected. Any number of things could happen, and while I do believe in the people of this great state that we would ultimately prevail and be successful in shooting this stuff down, I think it would really take all of us working on this and nothing else for the next 3 years to make sure that didn't happen. And 3 years from now, I'm not sure that we're going to have a labor movement in New York State. I'm not sure what battles the labor movement's going to be otherwise preoccupied with that they have to defend from the national level. The Working Families Party is entirely funded in large part funded by labor unions. This is a very real concern for us, and one that we think about in our annual plan every single year. So just taking a bet and saying, yeah, 3 years from now, I feel good that we'd be in a fine fighting form in New York State. I'm not willing to take that bet, and none of the labor unions are either. So that's one thing. There's still a way in which I would possibly see that this would be a worthwhile bet to make. If I could guarantee that the people who got elected, the delegates who got elected, were going to be really incredible folks, and I really trusted them and really believed that they were going to be far and away better than our current legislature, because I agree there's a lot of things that I would like to see changed in New York State that we struggle changing every year. I don't think that that's possible. It's really hard to run a state Senate-sized election. I imagine some people in this room have petitioned before, have done like election petitioning to get candidates on the ballot. It's a grueling process, and that's how these delegates would end up on the ballot. They have to petition. They have to get thousands of signatures, which is a very expensive thing to do. And then they have to run a Senate district-sized election, which can cost upwards of $500,000. Like, I certainly couldn't run to be a delegate. I don't have the time and I don't have the money, and most of the people I know don't either. And I think it's worthwhile to say that in the last constitutional convention in the 60s, 82% of the people who were elected delegates were current public office holders, so that was a minority, former public office holders, or had been like appointed or held a governmental position in some way or another. And why is that? Is because it's the people who are closest to kind of the party apparatuses here and the party bosses who are going to be able to pull off this very complicated mechanism of actually getting elected. So I think advocates for the ConCon make a big deal of the fact that, yes, like we would have definitely a majority of Democrats who ultimately became the delegates. That doesn't make me feel better. Like our current state government is already a majority of Democrats. And the state Senate, the state Assembly, and our governor are all Democrats. And I don't see a good argument for believing that the delegates would be radically more progressive than our current legislature. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Hey, thank you so much for taking a couple hours out of this gorgeous day to be here. It's really something to see this, and I love what Indivisible is doing across the state and the country. I don't know if you noticed, but there are over 3,400 Indivisible groups, at least one in every congressional district in the United States, including New York. And it speaks a lot to the volume of resistance against what's happening in Washington. But let me just, without further ado, let me just go on. So my name is Art Chang. I am actually a member of Civic Hall, for full disclosure. Despite that, I have not been able to convince Mika to endorse the Constitutional Convention as a sign of his independence. The other thing is that I've actually been in New York City government since 1990, and for the past 10 years, I've actually worn two hats. One is I've been on the New York City Campaign Finance Board, which runs the deepest and model campaign finance system in the world. Through that, I've been able to see the advantages of campaign finance and a level funding environment for encouraging smaller candidates to run. I also served for 5 years as the first and founding chair of something called the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee, which was tasked with bringing together all the mayoral offices, citywide offices, and the city board of elections, with the purpose of improving elections for New Yorkers. I'll tell you in a second about that. Then I've also spent 20 years actually in my primary job as a technologist. I've started about a dozen companies as a founder or co-founder, and I've advised a number of others. The area of specialization that I focused on was using technology to really empower frontline workers to have greater satisfaction in the work that they set out to do and deliver better value to their ultimate end customers. And so the work that I did primarily and significantly focused around real workers in very esoteric areas, including child welfare and campaign finance. And so we can talk about that when I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But let's move on to the next slide, if we can. So I did not come to this Constitutional Convention issue willingly or with interest until the public hearings that we conducted after the 2016 presidential elections. If you don't know, there were 112,000 voters who disappeared from the Brooklyn voter rolls in that election, causing massive confusion. And as a replacement effort, the city's Board of Elections offered them the opportunity of creating affidavit ballots so that their votes could be counted. At the end of that process, only 25% of the affidavit ballots were considered valid. We conducted hearings, heard the outrage from people about how their due process rights, which are set out in the law, were not followed by the city's Board of Elections with the backing of the State Board of Elections. And we started to do a lot of looking into the problem. And after having chaired that committee for 5 years, I can tell you that my conclusion was that voting reform would never happen in New York State without a constitutional convention. The problems are insidious and pervasive, and it amounts to implicit voter suppression. And I began to think about what else actually matters that we couldn't actually accomplish. Term limits, a balanced Board of Elections where the Democrats, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, could stop reform from happening for electing new candidates and for voter rights. There's some other ones here. Public campaign financing, ethics watchdog. You know, if you have a complaint about an issue related to ethics, where do you go? You can go to JCOPE, which people call J-Joke, but it's the only place that you have. And so these are things which actually are important to the people to preserve the core of our democracy, but which legislatures have proven over and over again that they won't fix. Next slide, please. So what does this amount to? This amounts to what we call the Incumbency Protection Plan. 25% of incumbents face no real challengers in their primary, resulting in 95% of incumbents getting reelected. So if you're an incumbent, you start thinking, well, what's the penalty for me if I choose not to do my voters' bidding? There is virtually none. And so what happens is that the Assembly has actually been quite good, and I'll talk about the Assembly in a second, but this has allowed people within the Senate to block major legislation from moving forward. And so what does this do for the balance of power? We've already now talked about the imbalance of power between voters and the elected officials. We now also have an imbalance of power between the government and between the governor and the legislature. How does most legislation happen? Meaningful legislation. It happens through the budget. And who do we depend upon for enacting any progressive legislation? It's the governor. If Cuomo were not on his good days wearing a progressive hat, many of the great things that he got enacted in the last budget wouldn't have happened. But it also doesn't prevent him from doing things like unilaterally deciding to propose to eliminate $300 million from the New York City Health and Hospital Corporation's budget, effective virtually immediately. So the next slide. So the spoils of incumbency have just, in this sort of insidious, creeping way, have increased to the point where it actually makes no sense. How can a legislator be deemed a part-time employee and therefore have the unlimited ability to get part-time jobs? And where do you think they get those jobs? Few of the legislators, and I just was actually speaking in front of Joanne Simon's groups earlier this week, actually take their part-time pay, which is about $80,000 a year, and actually work full-time. It takes a huge amount of commitment, sacrifice, and to do that. Another thing is that when campaign finance, because of the LLC loophole, is virtually unlimited. Any of you can set up unlimited numbers of LLCs, and through those vehicles, make contributions to your candidate. And the candidates, because they have no competition in the primary, and they're virtually assured of winning the general election, they don't spend all their campaign money. So what happens to it? It rolls over year after year, building up in their campaign war chest, and when they leave office, they have virtually unlimited ways to actually spend that money. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just skip the slide, but it's clear the Assembly is a vastly majority Democrat. The Senate is a highly gerrymandered district group, so it's nearly balanced. Next slide, please. And so what this means is that you have this group called the IDC, who I think everybody here is probably aware of, but they have the ability, without penalty, to actually block progressive legislation. Next slide, please. So I don't know if you know this, but vast swaths of the progressive resist agenda have already been passed by the Assembly and are being blocked by the IDC in the Senate. And so you look at these areas, every one of these, and this is actually a blog post I wrote, you can find it on Medium, every one of these is something that we all care about and should have passed the Senate because of the makeup of New York State, but being held up because of the broken system we have for electing people. Next slide, please. So we're a blue state. Next slide. I'm just going to So we also did an analysis of all the state Senate districts. I went back to 2014, looked at the national election results to see how people actually feel about policies. And you find that New York is actually a very blue state. 40 out of 63 state Senate districts voted for Hillary. There were another 6 or 7 that voted for Trump, but where Trump won by less than a 5% margin. Next slide.
Okay, 10 seconds.
Okay. And so what's happened since then is obviously groups like Indivisible have sprung up. The Women's March had sister marches across the country. In fact, there were over 20 in New York State alone, with most of those being upstate.
Okay, all right. So we'll come back.
Great, thank you very much.
Fairness.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely to like everything that you just said. 100% am in agreement with, I believe, everything that you said. In fact, I've cited that blog post of yours about the IDC and the things that have passed the state assembly, but the IDC blocked because that's so infuriating. I didn't know that you wrote it, so that's funny. But I think what I'm missing here is, I guess, if all of these things are the problem, and I agree, why is it that the ConCon is going to solve them? Like, it might be the only way we can see for now, or you argued that it's the only way we can see for now to fix these things, but how do we know that it actually will fix those things? How are we going to win hundreds of strong delegates? How are we going to make sure that we have the manpower and the money to legitimately fight back any terrible thing that does end up on the ballot? If the answer is just that the state of New York is Democratic, Hillary Clinton won here by an overwhelming margin, and the state Senate, despite being gerrymandered, is in fact Democratic, then that doesn't make me feel better or safe. The last Constitutional Convention was held 1967, just a few years after a presidential election that had meant that huge Democratic majorities swept in both houses of the New York State Legislature, bigger than we have right now. That election was won in New York State with a 10% greater margin than Clinton won it for Democrats this year. So I just don't see that affiliation with the Democratic Party is going, you would think, that being the case, that would have been the best ever conditions to have a truly progressive outcome, and nothing like that happened. A lot of good things, the delegates got a lot of good things on the ballot, but also some really, really bad ones, and because they were all tied together, and you had to vote them all up or down, we ended up with nothing. And maybe that's not the worst outcome. You try, you fail, maybe that's okay, except that this year we have the chance. We're playing defense a little bit here already. It's like if the New York State Constitution, it represents the walls outside of our city, and there's some problems with the walls, and we need to move the walls. We don't choose the time to tear our walls down when enemies are outside the walls battling and trying to get in, which is what it feels like to me to go to work every day right now. That's kind of a melodramatic comparison. That is what it feels like sometimes. And so it's a question of opportunity cost. Like, if we do this, we have to go all in. All of the left has to go all in on electing the right delegates. And then making sure that whatever they come up with the next year is whatever ends up on the ballot either passes or doesn't pass, and that we keep New Yorkers safe. And I would rather be ending the IDC. I would rather be primarying those people or getting rid of congressional Republicans who are in New York State and fighting for New Yorkers that way.
Mark, do you want to?
Sure. So I think Ava really hits on, one of the central things that people really have to decide upon, which is that do you need an absolute guarantee in order to be able to vote yes? Or are you willing to accept some risk in exchange for a lot of other truly fundamental reforms? And that's not, and I obviously have my point of view, and Ava has her point of view, but this is something that has come up in every single one of the over a dozen panels that I've been on, with folks representing, the great folks representing the no vote, who all seek this guarantee. And one of the things I want to remind people is that there's a significant difference between the federal government and the state government. The federal government is taking things away, which actually creates opportunity for the state to actually put those things in place, which is what the Assembly has done in so many areas. And it doesn't require a constitutional convention to actually take away many of the things that the unions and the Working Families Party are fighting for, many of those great things. In Michigan and Washington, it was not through changing the Constitution that they have totally, butchered this idea of what it means to have, worker reform, but it's happened through changes in their legislature, gerrymandering, hijacking of the state electoral makeup, and changing the voter rules to restrict progressive voters from voting. That's what causes, not a constitutional convention. I think it's very important to remember that. The other thing is you think about the time that this election is going to take place, the delegates, the convention itself, and then the final vote. These things will all happen during Trump's presidency. There is not going to be a better time for progressives to rise up and be energized to go and make something progressive happen. New York should not be compared to Michigan or Wisconsin, but it should be compared to California, Oregon, Washington, the 7 states that actually have democratic legislatures, governors, and voters. And this is a time to do that. The next time we're going to have is 20 years from now. And that could actually be something that we change through the convention. Why do we have to wait for 20 years? You think about what's happened in the past 20 years, and you think about what the future is going to be like for our children over the next 20 years. And this is really what is motivating me, is that when I look ahead for the next 20 years, do I believe that the status quo is going to leave New York a better place? Do I believe that the status quo is going to give our government the flexibility to resist Trump in a meaningful, effective way? Do I believe that changes that could happen by fixing fundamental things like voting would actually unblock the things that the legislature, Assembly has already passed, so that they can move forward, and my kids can enjoy clean air and, with full women's reproductive rights and the other things that have already passed the Assembly.
So I'd like to do is ask each of you a question, and then we're going to take it to the audience. My question for you, Ava, is, so if we don't go the path of a constitutional convention, then what is the realistic path for making New York more of a blue state, which, and you alluded to it a little bit, which was, taking out these IDC so-called Democrats and replacing them. They seem to be the fundamental block, right? So is there a case that that's a more realistic path to winning progressive reforms than the, let's go for a constitutional convention and change the lots of aspects of the system.
Yeah, I mean, you answered my question a little bit for me, which is just that, yes, absolutely,
Well, make the case. I wanna
we
hear you.
really need to take back the state senate. We need to get rid of the IDC. We need to primary IDC members.
And do you think that's more of a realistic, like, it's
Yeah.
really, we just heard about how hard it is to raise the money.
I think both things are
primary.
really hard.
Yeah.
I think both things are very, very, very hard. I don't feel, you know, the Constitution has been amended in New York State something like 200 something times, and like 190 something of them, or through legislative changes, like the legislature voted for them. So there are in fact other ways to do this, and ways that would make me personally feel a lot more good about, you know, having control of the process, or some modicum more of control than we would under a pretty dark, shadowy feeling, uncontrollable process that would happen if we elected these delegates, which that would mean, you know, we're talking right now about taking over 9 state senate seats. Imagine having to elect 3 state senators per Senate district, in every Senate district across all of New York State. Like that's the kind of scale of the fight that we're talking about, and that's really scary. And I guess I don't think that there's like a good enough argument for why doing this would produce a less status quo outcome than it would through the legislature if we were able to get rid of the IDC, right? You know, I think they're going to be by and large Democrats Democrats who are in the party system who get elected this way.
Okay, thanks. And if we could go back to Art's slides for a second, because we didn't really get to explain one, and I'm going to ask a question based on that slide. Well, I wanted to give each of you a question back to your own arguments. So this is an analysis of the district by district vote in 2016 that makes the argument that at 2016 levels of turnout, Democrats theoretically would win a much bigger majority of the state senate than they currently have, just by where the votes are. And so I have a 2-part question on this, because I wanted to give you a chance to talk about it and push you on it. This is for a high turnout cycle, which is a presidential year, right? So you're kind of giving us the most optimistic view, given that in a presidential year, more Democrats vote. Not in an off year when the voting for the delegates would be, right, in 2018. And the second part of the question is, what do you say to people who worry about the problem of outside money, flooding specific races, paying for, you know, independent TV ads that, you know, spook voters and help more Republicans get elected delegates?
Okay, this is going to be a moment. There are about 10 questions in there. I'm trying to figure out which order I'm going to go in. Let's talk about turnout for a second. So turnout is an important question. Do you know that New York is actually in the bottom 5 nationally in turnout, and that the only state that we beat on a regular basis is Mississippi? That actually we are often 48th or 49th in the country in terms of turnout. And it's a sign of actually how bad the voting system is, which is also another reason why the IDC can act with impunity on what they do. So the national election figures are interesting because, yes, it is a higher turnout, and statewide, more Democrats come out to vote. That actually on non-presidential years, more Republicans come out to vote statewide, and that is a fact. But when you look at the 2014 congressional data, which I actually don't have up here in this deck, New York actually voted in exactly the same proportions. And actually in the Hillary vote, one congressional district flipped from Democrat to Republican. in a district that was always very, very tight between the Democrats and the Republicans. So we actually have, data that shows a track record of what happens in non-presidential and presidential elections. The question about outside money is always a good one. Nobody here is a fan of the Citizens United decision. But there are a couple interesting points here. One is that in New York City, we heavily regulate independent expenditures within the confines of the Citizens United decision. And what we have seen across the city is that New Yorkers are actually a pretty obstinate and stubborn bunch and not super affected by outside independent spending. In fact, independent spenders have wasted virtually all their money in trying to affect races in New York City. Now, going back to the question of guarantees, there is, of course, no guarantee that this would remain the same. But the Mercers and the Koch brothers have not made a play. So if they're going to actually play, now would be the time to do it. Because this is a time where if they really believe they can swing New York State's constitutional convention to the right, then they should actually be part of the yes vote. And they have actually not participated with any money in this race at all. In fact, virtually most of the money has actually come from the unions on the no side. And just as a note, and this is with all due respect to Ava and the Working Families Party and all of these folks on their side who I just really love and support, there are a couple members of their group who I actually would never, ever be part of the same coalition with. Right to Life and the NRA. And that alone, for me, is almost an allergic reaction to voting no. And is a reason to vote yes. Because this coalition of folks is a question I'm going to give you another question that you should think about. That all these folks agree that the status quo is preferable to the risk to making change happen. If you are satisfied with this status quo, which works in all the favor of not just these groups that I mentioned, but also the Republican Party is against this, the Conservative Party is against this, the IDC is against this. Why are they all against it? It's because it potentially upends the status quo. And so when we talk about investment, the investment that the Koch brothers and these others would seek to make is actually, think about what all the investment that the folks who are in this no coalition have made in their existing legislators. If you have these incumbency that runs forever, they have invested lots of money in keeping these people in office. And the Constitutional Convention actually puts all of that investment at risk.
Okay, so terrific. I know we could go back and forth another round, but I see we have about 20 minutes or so. I sort of promised we'd end by 2:15. So what I want to do now is try and get as many questions from the audience and a chance for each of you to respond, though please keep your responses short too, so we can get to lots of questions. So raise your hand if you have a question, and I'm going to play Phil Donahue. Okay, I'm going to start all the way in the back. Just tell us your name and where you're from.
I'm Stephanie, and I live here in Yonkers, and I have a lot of questions, but a couple of my questions is how is this convention going to get rid of the IDC, one, and how would the Democratic be involved in selecting those delegates to this convention if it does happen?
Okay.
So I guess that's directed at me. So it's not actually an anti-IDC convention. I mean, right on the face of it, right? The convention would not be about opposing those legislators. But it would be about actually changing the rules that allow, voters to actually have more control over their legislators. And number two is really allowing competitors to run competitive races by lowering the barriers to running those races. Unless you get a second part of your question.
Right, so the other question was, how would the Democratic Party itself be influencing the choice of delegates?
How would the Democratic Party influence the choice of delegates? A lot. a lot. I mean, it is always easier to run slates of delegates because you can then make marketing much more efficient. The unions will be doing the same thing. You know, our groups who are all on our side will all be doing the same thing, and all of us will be doing the same thing. Now, just as a matter of note here and of interest is that actually there is no difference in the process between voting for delegate and voting for your state senators. So why should we be afraid? We go and vote anyway.
So Ava, do you want to just add? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say that if I knew that the convention, or had reason, not if I know, I don't need certainty. If I had reason to believe that the convention would lead to those outcomes, I might feel differently. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that the delegates who get elected to this convention are going to be any different than the current outcome that we see in our legislation right now, and the risk is so huge that it outweighs that. And yeah, I mean, again, like, it's really hard to petition. It's really hard to run for a state Senate seat. The Democratic Party is going to be hugely influential in who is actually able to overcome all those boundaries. You need lawyers, you need campaign finance people. There's so much you need to be able to do this. It's not going to be a people's convention. And by the way, this is the Democratic Party that has allowed the IDC to fester and exist for years and years and years. The Democratic Party that is chaired by Andrew Cuomo, the most powerful Democratic in the state, who has allowed all this to this horrible situation to come to be. So the Democratic Party is the reason we're here in some ways in New York State, and I'm not going to bet on them for being like the game changers next year.
Okay, other questions? Go to this young woman.
Hi. Many people I respect quite a bit are really afraid of the whole idea of pensions. You know, teachers, nurses, union people. They say no because this is going to open a Pandora's box and put those pensions at risk and really risk their ability to support themselves after they retire.
Who's that addressed to?
Either.
Okay, the risk in pensions. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the many really horrible things that could happen for workers here. There's kind of a legal back and forth about what would happen. And one of the legal tools that legal scholars in New York State have put forward, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, obviously, but that would happen is, I went to school in Illinois, in Chicago, where they're currently having this exact same battle. There's a budget crisis. And so they're trying to not pay the pensions of public workers because they're saying we have a budget crisis. And a lot of lawyers have argued that if that was the case, the state only needs a compelling reason to say we don't have to pay your pension that we promised to pay. And a compelling reason could be we have a budget crisis, which could happen here. That can't happen because of the New York State Constitution currently. It says, regardless of what happens, you are always paying the pensions you agreed to pay. So this is one of, I think, many, many, many concerns that could potentially arise.
I'm going to keep asking you guys to also listen for conjecture versus facts. And I'm going to just say a few facts. Number one is that through the Constitution Amendment process that was already described, the legislature can go about and try to change this provision in the Constitution anyway. That actually the pensions for private workers who work for private companies represented by unions are not protected under the Constitution. It's only the public unions who are protected under the Constitution. And those contracts in the private sector get negotiated all the time, as do the contracts in the public sector, and not always to the benefit of the public workers either. So getting to the actual legal nature of the guarantee, the guarantee comes solely because of the fact that the word contract was used in describing the pensions enjoyed by public workers under the state's constitution. Because of the word contract, it is backed by the U.S. Constitution under the Emoluments Clause. So you can look at an E-M-O-L-U-M-E-N-T-S clause. And nationally, this pensions earned to date cannot be taken away. Now, there's no guarantee that this can't change in the future, but the pensions earned to date cannot be taken away up to the date of the ending of that contract. So, yes, pensions could be at risk. if you don't trust your fellow New Yorkers. But pensions are already guaranteed and they're not going to change. And that guarantee cannot be removed. Now, there is one method, and I do want to be clear because I think this is a fact. I know this is a fact, and by the way, I'm not a lawyer either, but I've studied this issue, and I'm surrounded by lawyers who have studied this issue, that if New York were to become insolvent and actually declare bankruptcy, Illinois is not doing this. Illinois actually is saying we don't have enough money, and they're using it as a bargaining tool to force unions to back down and to raise public anger against the unions. That's what's happening. In New York, the only way that New York can actually get out of its pension obligations is if it goes bankrupt. We are the second wealthiest state in the country, with the second highest credit rating in the country. It is inconceivable that in our lifetimes, that New York State would actually deplete its resources to the point where it would put those pensions up at risk. And that's not an issue for the Constitutional Convention anyway.
Okay, more questions, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, both of you, for being here and helping us to understand the issue. I think my question is probably more for you, Art, and it has to do with the sort of resource allocation issue, and especially looking at divided government and getting it unified and getting the Senate to be completely blue. There's not only the IDC, but as you said, there were 8 additional districts that went for Hillary that have Republicans sitting in them, so those are potentially flippable seats as well. And so I guess, can you talk a little bit more about resource allocation? Why not focus energy and resources on the IDC, on those 8 flippable seats, rather than a long multi-year process that, carries tremendous risk as well?
Thank you. And I just want to say that this is actually not an either-or question. It's a both and. We have to fight the IDC while we, on my side, move forward with the Constitutional Convention. Because getting rid of the IDC is important because raising the issue helps people understand what's wrong with our democracy, even if we don't work. Now, the other thing to remember about gerrymandering, and you saw the representation of the Assembly versus the Senate, the reason why the Senate doesn't look like the Assembly is because of gerrymandering. But who does gerrymandering actually benefit? Historically and nationally, gerrymandering has been for the favor of the incumbents. It has been for a particular snapshot of a demographic profile of a place. And what has also been shown over and over again, and not with complete reliability, is that when the actual seat swaps, the gerrymandering is no longer as effective. Because you have 2 different changes. Number one, you have a new candidate, which causes everyone to rethink their fundamentals, because you don't know what this new candidate, being junior in their legislature, is going to be able to bring back for their district. And the second thing is that with the increasing diversity of our country, the makeup of virtually every Senate district becomes more progressive. And so voting restrictions, implicit voter restrictions, making it more difficult for people to run, those are the things that help keep people in power. And that's really the biggest risk. And I think that it is a risk, there's no question about it.
David, do you want to jump on that at all?
I mean, sure, yeah. I think I've hit the same point a few times now, but I guess I would just say that everybody thought that 2016 was our year, not just nationally, but in New York State. Like everybody thought that this was the year we were going to take back the state senate. Like we were going to ride Hillary Clinton's coattails to victories across New York State, and that was not the case at all. We lost everything that we sought to gain. Barely held on to what we did hold on to. And I think it was 20 counties that Obama won in the last presidential election that Hillary lost this year. So, it's a real question. And again, if there was, I'm not asking for certainty, if there was a good reason to believe that this would, that we would get voting reform and we would end gerrymandering out of the Constitutional Convention, I could conjecture and argument for this, but I don't see a reason to believe that this is going to be any different than what we already have, and it's going to take all of our resources.
Okay. Yeah.
I think you've made the point that from your perspective, the main reason for having this convention is to try and improve the balance of power between the voters and the elected officials. But that the process of the convention is going to involve the election of delegates by the parties that are currently responsible for this imbalance of power. In which case, I don't see that they have any incentive of changing the Constitution in any substantive way to improve the balance in favor of the voters.
I'm sorry that I must have said something to make you misinterpret this. We did not actually, the parties don't select the delegates.
They are selected delegates to go up for a vote for us.
They actually don't. Actually, in New York State, anybody can run for Senate with or without their party endorsement. The party endorsement is what gives you the ability to get the backing of the party and their money and their other resources. In New York State, if you are a Democrat and you want to run on the Democratic line for Senate or actually for delegate, it's a fairly onerous process, but it's achievable. You need 1,000, if you want to run as a Democrat on a Democratic ticket, you need 1,000 signatures from people who live in your district who have not pledged themselves to another delegate or another senator. And 1,000 seems like a very high number, but there are also ways in this day and age where we can start to use social technologies and other technologies to begin to think about using a little bit of crowdsourcing in addition to face-to-face to make that process easier. And so one of the goals of my group, based upon my experience with the Campaign Finance Board and tools that we created to simplify campaign funding from smaller dollar contributions, we believe we can do the same thing actually in easing and smoothing the ballot petition process.
So you're expecting the
Okay,
numbers to look different than what it looks like on this slide?
Yeah, that's clearly what he's expecting. I want to get to a few more questions. Let's go right here. Okay.
I'm trying to understand why gerrymandering affects the Senate races and not the Assembly races.
Yep.
Any thought on that?
I actually don't have a good answer for you. I wish I knew myself. I wish I could give you a straight answer, but I don't have the facts, so I can't make something up.
I think the thought is that actually there is gerrymandering in the assembly, it's just in the other direction somewhat.
So we don't mind.
Yes.
That's acceptable. So I think we're pretty much all agreed that there are potentially wonderful benefits from a ConCon if things go our way. And we're also very concerned about risks. But Art, one of the things you brought up is the notion that we're undergoing a changing demographic, which over time would be more favorable to progressive views. Given that we're afraid of the risks, wouldn't that be an argument for holding back on a ConCon now and having a more favorable climate sometime in the future when we can either get amendments through the legislature or a ConCon down the line that would work for us?
Either of you can answer.
Well, I can. So, 20 years is a long time to wait. And if you look at the rights and privileges that people have gained in our country over the past 20, and where we thought we'd be going in the next 20, I'd say, well, yeah, I could see waiting 20 years, but given the direction our country is going, I can't see that direction happening. The other thing that's actually very interesting about the demographics today is this year is the first time that the number of millennials have actually exceeded the number of baby boomers. The other interesting fact is that if you were 21 in 1993 when the internet was open to the public, you are now 50.3% of the population. That actually the demographics have shifted already tremendously, and they're just accelerating. Technology is actually a huge force for lots of different reasons. We have to, the Constitution does not address things like the Equifax breach, which affects all New Yorkers. It does not address what the contract is between New Yorkers and the state with respect to our digital rights and privacy. We also are at a place where millennials actually don't have address books because they all know their people on the social web. And so when you think about the analog world of things like candidacy and elections, you can see that there's this insidious cultural gap that's happening between younger folks and older folks because of this digital divide. And it's not a digital divide as much by access, it's a digital divide by culture. And so now is a time to get those folks active and in the process. And there is no better way to do that than this Constitutional Convention. Otherwise, I fear that we're going to actually lose another 20 years of having this gap grow bigger and bigger. And people who this is going to really hurt are lower income and minority folks.
Okay, we have time for like 2 more questions, so I want to make sure your question is something that has not been asked already. Yes.
Hi. This is a very brass tacks question. How much does the convention cost and who ends up paying for it?
Okay. I'll take this one because no one really knows. Politico actually did the best analysis. And there are a couple different methods. One method is to take the cost of the 67 convention and then bring it forward in terms of real-time dollars, and that would be somewhere in the mid-double-digit millions. Others have said that things are more expensive today. It could be this convention may last longer, so it could be $100 million. And Politico has said that it's in the kind of $50 to $80 million range with an upper bound of somewhere around $120 million, which is far from what the no vote has presented of $300 million and up. Now, the other thing that no one is taking into consideration is the prevalence of social tools, actually, in all of this. Things like Councilmatic, things like the Chisel, Advocate.io, things that actually will increase both the transparency, but also the ability of a convention to run much more in a virtual kind of world, open to the public.
Okay, one more back here. You get the last question.
Wait, I think she wanted to answer.
You want to answer too?
Really
You have more to say on that? It seemed like such a simple question.
Yeah, just quickly, I think on the ConCon side, people tend to make a big deal of how much the cost is. I think that's like the worst argument we could levy against this. I think if there was a credible shot at achieving what the pro side said we could achieve, then I would say it'd be worth a whole bunch of money, like a whole bunch more than it has been proposed. I think the cost that I'm really worried about is, we talked earlier about changing demographics and how digital tools are going to reshape who comes out this time, and all of these things, of course, were said about 2016 as well. And we lost big. In New York State, we lost by more than we should have. And so the cost, what I know is going to happen, we can conjecture that these things are going to change somehow the dynamic of the outcome of this election. What I know is going to happen is that labor is going to have to spend all of its money, and the community groups in rooms like this are going to have to spend all of your time fighting back possible attacks when we could be playing offense on battles that we know that we can win, and that we have a shot of changing the system in another way that way.
Okay, last question.
Okay, this is a real quick question for Art. Art, you've given the impression that we now have a window, and that the window won't come up for another 20 years to change the Constitution. But that's not my understanding. My understanding is that we can change it at any time. So can you address that, please?
As Mika said before, it takes 2 sessions of the legislature to pass a potential amendment in consecutive sessions, not in the case of years, but actually in 2 different legislative sessions, so 2 years apart. And the amendment also can't change at all. I mean, it can't change, not a single word of it can change before the next one. And so I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of homework. go and look at the last 200 amendments that were made to the Constitution and tell me how many of those were actually meaningful. Although I would like to note that the Adirondacks provision has been the most amended section, and the last time we approved an amendment, we allowed exploratory open strip mining to happen in the Adirondacks. The other thing I want you to look at is actually the legislative track record of the Senate. So when you go into the senate.gov and you look up bills that were passed, I challenge you to look at those bills and tell me how many of those bills were meaningful. About 200 bills are passed, the lowest number since 1908.
Okay. Last comment, Ava, on this, sir. Just to be clear, I have a factual wrinkle, though. The last time we had a convention, it was called by the legislature, correct? And it didn't require 2 votes over 2 cycles. It was literally a big sweep in 1966, I guess, and then they decided to take that opportunity to call for a convention. Is that correct?
It was ordered by the courts because of our gerrymandered.
It was ordered by the courts. Even better. Yes, okay.
Yes, it was ordered by the courts because it was so gerrymandered, and the person who presided over it was the current head of the assembly, and the person who was the minority leader, or the majority leader in the convention was the actual majority leader in the assembly. So it was like a mini assembly, but
Okay.
or 2.
So I know there are a few more questions. I also just want to be respectful of people's time and our speakers' time. We will hang out, and they don't have to run right away. So if you still want to buttonhole them and ask questions, by all means do. So I said we were going to end with a vote just to see if anybody's minds have been changed. Right. And so just to recall, it was 17 no, 2 yes, and 17 unsure. Now,
16 no.
well, okay, so, and I should also say that a few people have come in and a few people have left, so this is not a scientific survey, okay? It's just a straw poll. Having listened to everything, we'll ask the question the exact same way. Are you currently feeling that you're going to vote yes? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, are you currently feeling that you're going to vote no? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 15, I see 15. 15 no, and are you still undecided, or you've moved to undecided? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 undecided. Okay, so we have a bit of a shift, right? Yeah. And some people didn't vote, it looks like. Okay, that's probably okay too, well, we moved some opinions, and in either direction, I'm sure people's opinions are going to continue to vacillate as we, think about this. We're going to post the video of this debate, this forum, on our Facebook page, and I would say
On our website.
On our website.
And
we should also put it on the Facebook page,
yeah.
because if you're in the Facebook group for NYCD 16, you could continue to have this conversation there, which I think would be great, because we have about 1,000 members, and obviously people are going to keep thinking about this. This is an important question. Yes?
It's going to be posted to something that's open to the public, because it would be nice to be able to share it with people outside.
I assume the website is shareable. That's a YouTube.
What is the website?
The URL of the website is nycd16indivisible.org.
Thank you.
You see it? Well, I don't know if you see it.
Yeah,
right
no,
now.
it's on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on there.
It's on there. And with that, thank you, everybody. If you want to canvass, Liz,
Good for you.
thank you to our speakers. Our next general meeting is November 9th.
Lucy's having a garden.
In the evening, and Andrew, what
Could I
the
just say
announcement?
one quick announcement, because the IDC came up a lot, obviously, in our discussion today. And on November 12th at Lehman College, we're doing a deep dive into the IDC. We've got Zephyr Teachout and Andrea Stewart-Cousins along with some other powerful speakers and advocates to understand more about the IDC. And so those invitations are going to go out to our group within the next couple of days, but I just wanted to mention it to everybody here.
Is that a public event? I mean, is that my group putting it out?
We're going to push it out first through our email lists to this group and the IDC Action Group and other IDC allies throughout the city, and then as we get closer to it, we're going to let it go on social media. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you. 3 to 5 at Lehman College on Sunday, November 12th. Great.